I'm 103. Here's the truth I discovered at 76 that changed everything. At 76, my doctor told me I had maybe 5 years left. My joints were failing, my memory was slipping. I had already attended more funerals than birthdays. Today, I am 103. And the thing that saved me wasn't medicine, it wasn't a diet, it wasn't a supplement or a morning routine or a cold shower. It was a conversation with a stranger in a hardware store. And what he told me in the 5 hours that followed, I have never heard anyone say it out loud. Not a doctor, not a therapist, not a book. Let me tell you exactly what happened. I was a school teacher for 38 years, history and geography. I retired at 67, healthy, with a good pension, the kind of retirement everyone says you should want. For a few years, it was fine. Travel, books, grandchildren's school plays. But around 74, something started going wrong that had no name. It wasn't depression. It was more like a slow dimming, a light that doesn't burn out. It just gets less bright so gradually that you don't notice until one day the room is quite dark and you're not sure when that happened. I had 3 medications, pre-diabetes, an arthritic knee, blood pressure my doctor called something we should keep an eye on. None of it was unusual for my age. That was the most frightening part. It was all perfectly normal. Then one Tuesday in February, my wife was away. The house was quiet. I sat at this kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon with a cup of tea that had gone cold. And I thought a thought I had been carefully not thinking for 2 years. Nobody needs me to do anything today. Not self-pity, just a fact. Like noting it was raining, the world was turning without any input from me. And I thought, is this it? Is this just what the last part looks like? 3 weeks later, I went to the hardware store. I had developed a habit of going with no real purpose. I found it soothing, the smell of timber and metal, every object existing because it helped build or fix something. I was standing in the timber aisle when I noticed an old man at the far end. And when I say old, I was 76. I did not think of myself as old, but this man had gone beyond old into something else. His hands were extraordinary, mapped with veins and decades of use. He was measuring timber, seriously, with a proper tape measure. I walked over. "What are you building?" He looked up. His eyes were completely sharp, present. "A bookshelf," he said, "floor to ceiling." Then he stopped. "Do you actually want to know, or are you being polite?" I thought about it. "I actually want to know," I said. His name was Arthur. He was 91 years old. Since retiring 26 years earlier, he had learned woodworking, studied Italian, grown wine-quality grapes in a climate supposedly wrong for it, written 2 novels he described as honestly not very good but completely worth writing, and was currently building a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf because his study lacked wall space. We left together, sat in a diner 2 streets away, stayed 5 hours. At some point, I asked him directly, "Doesn't it feel pointless at 91, starting things you might not finish?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "At what age did pointlessness become a reason not to do something?" I had no answer. He kept going. "When you started a new school year at 35, did you know which students would remember you? Did you know if it mattered? But you showed up, you prepared, you cared, because the caring was the point. The caring was what made you a living person, rather than a person who was simply still alive." He said this quietly, eating pie, looking out the window, like he was noting something obvious, but it detonated in me, because I realized, sitting in that diner, that somewhere in the previous few years, I had made a private decision I had never consciously made. I had decided that the future wasn't really mine anymore. Not dramatically, not in a single moment. I had just gradually, quietly stopped treating my own future as a place where things worth caring about could still happen. Arthur had never made that decision. That was the entire difference between us. Let me tell you some things that are factually true, not things I believe, things that have been measured. A researcher at Yale named Becca Levy spent decades studying how people's perception of their own aging affects their physical health. People who viewed aging as decline died on average 7.5 years earlier than those who viewed it positively. That is more than the benefit of not smoking, more than regular exercise. The story you tell yourself about what it means to be your age is, biologically, one of the most powerful forces operating on your body. Studies of centenarians across cultures, from Okinawa to Sardinia, found that the most consistent factor in extreme longevity was not diet, not genetics. It was engagement. These people were embedded in things. They were needed. They had ongoing roles that would be noticeably incomplete without them. In Okinawa, they have a word, ikigai, usually translated as reason for being. But a better translation is simply the thing that makes it worth getting up. Even at 95, even at 102, people in these communities could answer that question immediately, specifically, not vaguely. My tomatoes, the neighbor who only talks to me, the novel I'm still revising. Sociologists call it role exit. What happens when a person leaves a role central to their identity without replacing it? Retirement, when unmanaged, is statistically dangerous because for many people, retirement causes invisibility, and invisibility has physical consequences. When I sat at that kitchen table on that Tuesday, I wasn't sick. I was purposeless. And purposelessness, it turns out, looks exactly like sickness. If it was a decision, I could make a different one. I didn't transform overnight. What I did was slower, uglier, and more specific than that. Not as a gimmick. Every time I said, I'm retired, I was declaring that my usefulness had concluded. I replaced it with a word I invented, reassignment. I had been reassigned. New post, no salary, no title, but still on duty, still figuring out for what. Language is not decoration. It is architecture. It shapes what you believe is possible, not a goal, a hard thing, something I couldn't already do, something I could genuinely fail at. At 77, basic carpentry, terrible at first. My wife looked at my first shelf and said, "It has character." I kept going. At 81, a kitchen garden, 4 raised beds, fed 4 neighboring families, required me to learn something new every single season. Never finished. Always mid-something. At 88, adult literacy. One evening a week at the local library, a 71-year-old man who had spent his entire life disguising the fact that he couldn't read sat across from me and read a letter from his daughter out loud and wept. I wept too. At 94, email. Then I wrote personal letters to 200 strangers just to see what would happen. 140 wrote back. Several of those correspondences are still going. None of these things were grand, but every single one required me to be specifically, attentively, genuinely alive. By 76, my social world was entirely comfortable. Everyone agreed with me. No one challenged me. It was pleasant. It was also intellectually airless. The brain needs resistance. So I joined an intergenerational community group. I was the oldest person in the room by 4 decades. I was frequently confused. My assumptions were regularly questioned. It was neurologically demanding and completely alive-making. There's an enormous difference. The person who manages their health lives in a defensive relationship with their body, protecting, preserving, anxious about every symptom. The person who uses their body treats it as a tool for doing things that matter. You maintain a tool not because you're afraid of it failing, but because you need it to work. When I made that shift, the anxiety largely dissolved, not because symptoms disappeared, but because they stopped being the main story. At the end of our 5 hours, Arthur took a paper napkin and wrote 3 questions, slid it across the table. I ask myself these every morning, he said, not as a ritual, as actual questions that require actual answers. If you can't answer them, the day has no foundation. I have kept those questions for 27 years. Not what do I know? What am I still trying to understand? This keeps the brain in active inquiry. The neuroscience is clear. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to maintain itself, depends on active engagement. The brain that wakes up with something it is genuinely trying to figure out is a brain in a state of active maintenance. Not general goodwill, the specific thing that only you, with your particular history, your skills, your accumulated experience, can offer. This question, asked daily, prevents purposelessness. It keeps you embedded in actual relationship, the non-transferable kind. Arthur explained. It's not about shame, it's about commitment. The things you've started have made a claim on you. They would be diminished if you walked away now. Those are your forward obligations, what you owe the future version of yourself. When I answer that question honestly, it tells me exactly what I actually value, as opposed to what I've told myself I value. 3 questions every morning, before the day decides what it wants to be. I want to talk directly to you now. If you are somewhere between 50 and 80, there is a reasonable chance that some version of what I described at 76 is either happening to you or beginning to. The slow dimming, the mornings without pull, the quiet, invisible decision to treat the future as something that is no longer quite yours. I want to tell you something about that. Those 2 things feel identical from the inside, but they are not the same. The difference is not biological. The difference is the decision. I am still working on something. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it's unfinished. At 103, I have something I am still trying to understand. Someone who still needs something only I can give, and something I would be embarrassed to quit. That is enough. That has always been enough. The morning Arthur and I left that diner, I watched him walk toward his car. An old man with a tape measure in his pocket, walking toward something he was building. An old man with a tape measure in his pocket, walking toward something he was building. An old man with a tape measure in his pocket, walking toward something he was building. I stood on that pavement and thought, I want to walk like that. I went home, made a different cup of tea. The kind I actually liked, not the kind I'd been making out of habit. Small thing, deliberate thing, and I began. Small thing, deliberate thing, and I began.